Hey, Brooks.
Well, hello there, Jack. I think we are live. Just letting you know we are live on the YouTubes as well.
I will prepare myself accordingly.
Yeah, try to avoid all those, toss-breaking words you love saying all the time.
Got a problem, man. Got a
Mhm.
problem.
What can I say? That's what I expect.
Hey, you know me, man. I'm a was, not was kind of guy.
Now recording.
Excellent. We'll start up the event. I had us in actually an awkward place for a moment. Let me pull out. Been doing some more translations on this stuff week, so I had us at the top of, I fucking hate this PDF. I had us at the order of law, just after the nada nada line from last week. Is that about right for you?
Hold on a second.
214, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Cool, cool.
Hold on. I'm trying to see. Did we read 213? Yeah,
We
the
did.
young gods thing came up. Okay. Yeah, I agree with you guys. 214 order of law.
Sweet. Order of law. This is actually a fun section, I think. We're starting to get into the workings and why we've gone over everything. Because up until this point, it's been very much I don't want to say a theoretical exercise, but it's been, I know JK every week has been asking, so when the fuck are we getting to Oedipus? You've asked it much nicer than that, but I think that's my summary of my short version of all the questions, which is a fair thing to ask. Like, when are we getting to the stuff? Why are we going over all of these things? Why are they doing this universal history? And we're starting to get to some of the things that are going to be answering again to that first question that they really keep driving at. Why do men desire their own repression? How does fascism work like that? Answering Reich, giving a psychoanalytic materialist view to the whole thing. So this is where we really start doing that. So it's fun. And finally, I think we get into some really fun discussions. So that'll be good, but I'll kick us off because it's that time to dive into hello, everyone, and welcome to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Take 3. We are in 3.7, making our way through how the law and inscription and writing and graphism and everything shift under the tyrant, under the despot, under the state existence, everything. And now we're about to hit the law, how the law works and how it operates. And it's been a fun journey to get to this point. What is a light way to talk about it? What do you think is the light way to sort of bring us up to speed for those who weren't with us last week?
Nada, nada.
Yeah, something like that. The movement of the way that repression necessarily has to work, the way that punishment now operates, I think is kind of where we're at. Again, we've got to think of the genealogy of things, the geology of morals and how these things come to be, the geology of these systems. So when we go all the way back, we're talking about the earth, we've got this theater of cruelty where people watch these sort of horrifying rites of initiation that carve into people these deep, massive sort of rule sets of how to behave, where their debt is, and so they can find themselves organized socially, and sort of know their sort of semi-fuzzy place. But again, semi-fuzzy because we don't have, hard lines of what means what or what anything is at a given time. There's a lot more sort of demand of the earth. The move to the despot, though, changes all of that. And aside from how we now have the written word, with this sort of transition also to the justice of the despot, the theater of cruelty doesn't go away, not all of the pieces. Its operant does. And so now it's less that we watch in order to partake and have the eye be a thing that sees so we know that it is seen. But now that it is seen, so we can extract specifically vengeance, cruelty, this shift of what justice and punishment means. Punishment becomes vengeance. It becomes something that is due. It becomes something almost transcendent. And this move, as we make the law, as we see these things get punished, as we see these things operate, the law, it operates very differently than just general rule sets that tribes had prior to that. So we'll be getting into that, though. Sorry, go ahead, JK.
So the despot, right? The vengeance of the despot is coincides with this kind of idea of punishment, but it also coincides with the elevation of the death instinct, right?
Yes.
And the death instinct is sort of this kind of you know this despotic power, will to power that overrides everything, and that becomes the law, right? The law that is separated from desire and is defines what desire is. I mean, it's separate from desire, right?
Oof.
Wells,
You ask
yeah,
you ask so many loaded questions sometimes that it makes it real tough.
yeah.
So I definitely don't want to say will to power, although maybe depending on how you're using it, maybe, but will to power just might be a little too close to will to power, and it's not really sort of that, at least not in the Nietzschean sense, or not how Deleuze reads Nietzsche. So I kind of want to avoid that particular language. The death instinct is a really unique sort of thing, because we have sort of I don't want to say fuck instinct, but the pleasure principle, the way that connection happens in these things. But with Freud, the thanatos, the push of this, the way that Deleuze and them want to sort of play with these things shifts a little bit from how they were sort of dealing with it. Instead, the death instinct is, I mean, kind of like Freud, but it's much more of a desire to entropy, or the bend towards entropy, towards how to put it. Jack, you got something for me?
But the death instinct is what Freud did with that too. But it's sort of like it's similar to what the despot does, right? It's the elevation of the death instinct that separates it from desire. Separates it from the life instinct, as though they were two different desires, and so that's what Freud did, and that's also Deleuze is saying that that's what the despot, how despots treats treats the desire, as though the death instinct is separate from desire. Would that be correct?
Is it separate from desire, though?
I mean, so I would say it is, but I'm also hesitant to say it's separate from desire, just in I think the same way Jack is. Like the death instinct's the body without organs, ultimately, the slippery surface that breaks connections and sort of creates the sort of secondary sort of elements, the different connections, and the avoidance of the same over and over and over being done. The death instinct is that. Now there's a way to over-identify with it. Anti-production under capitalism, and as we're starting to see under the despot, anti-production and how it's utilized gets misunderstood as an instinct, and that's what we're starting to see. So there's a lot of different things that are sort of at play here. So when we talk about death, when we talk about the death instinct, when we talk about anti-production, we're starting to see how these elements, I think we're starting to see, I would say, how they're becoming, I don't want to say confused, but how they're starting to mirror each other and seem similar, because as we sort of move forward, we're going to get into one of the things they brought up in chapter 2, when they really talked through the death instinct and the sort of nature of habitual habit forming, or how repression sort of operates, that these things become mistaken. This is the sort of, this is the play they're making with the death instinct, and have been. It's tougher to sort of talk about here, though. Jack, what was your thought?
When you say that the elevation of the death that's associated with the despot is this kind of perversion of of desire, the perversion of the body without organs, that somehow it's a kind of a transcendent move, right?
Hmm.
It's a misuse of the understanding of desire, desire and production, and that's exactly what Freud does too. He elevates the death instinct and separates it from the id, from the eros itself.
Yes. And
Whereas it should be death should be part of the life force,
and I think
part
that's
of
why
the
Jack was a little hesitant to say, is it separate? Like, it's separate in the sense that we talk about it separately, but it is part and parcel of desiring production. Jack, is that a fair way to put it?
right.
Um, I would take in the context of the last paragraph, right, where they're talking about. I mean, basically, the move is with the trend with with the introduction of the second paralogism, right? Wi- Under the primitive socius, the death drive or like anti-production is part of it's like it's part of the syntheses more generally, right? It's not misused. With the introduction of the second paralogism, it is misused, right? And the death drive, the implication is that it becomes there's a transcendent use of it. So you get a basically a discussion about how there's a kind of imminent use of it, which they'll go over in different ways throughout this chapter, and how there's transcendent use of it. So I mean that's where you got to be careful because it's still desire, right? It's still a transcendent use of desire. It's just a misuse of desire.
Yeah, it's the change in how death is handled. One of the I just recently on another stream went over the sort of writing Bataille did on the Aztecs, and I always love that because one of the things he really goes over is the nature of how they sort of treat death, how they talk through how he talks through how a warrior would go out on the battlefield, and if he brings someone back, they kill that person because to them someone is going to die. If the warrior dies on the battlefield, that counts almost because to them death is sort of a fact of things and sort of part of the process of living. There's a shift that happens when you reach the point of the despot where death is no longer sort of this thing that it just happens, this fact of life, but is now something that is an on high threat that is brought down by someone. It is a transcendent law. The result of it, the punishment of it, the threat of death is there for everything. And so the death instinct now becomes through this detached odd thing. It's no longer about the interplay of, as they say, no longer the interplay of savage actions and reactions. I think that's literally, we're about to actually say this, so I'm kind of skipping ahead. I was skipping to this paragraph, but it's no longer sort of this interplay, but it's now this agent of overcoding, this thing that pushes sort of this next bit. So one of the sort of challenges we have is being able to see it as that and understand how it's being made, this transcendent element. What is that process and what is it doing? So for that, I'm actually just going to read the paragraph because I think it answers a good amount of the question. Let me know if anyone has questions, of course, here. I'll make sure to answer, but off we go. As vengeance, and a vengeance exercised in advance, the imperial barbarian law crushes the whole primitive interplay of action, the enacted and reaction. Passivity must now become the virtue of the subjects attached to the despotic body. As Nietzsche says when he shows precisely how punishment becomes a vengeance in the imperial formations, a tremendous quantity of freedom must have been expelled from the world, or at least from the visible world, and made, as it were, latent under the hammer blows and artist's violence. There occurs a detachment and elevation of the death instinct, which ceases to be coded in the interplay of savage actions and reactions where fatalism was still something enacted, in order to become the somber agent of overcoding the detached object that hovers over each subject, as though the social machine had come unstuck from its desiring machines. Death, the desire of desire, the desire of the despot's desire, a latency inscribed in the bowels of the state apparatus. Better not a sole survivor than for a single organ to flow outside this apparatus or slip away from the body of the despot. This is because there is no other necessity, no other fatum, than that of the signifier in its relationships with its signified, such is the regime of terror. What the law is supposed to signify will only be revealed later, when it has evolved and assumed the new figure that appears to place it in opposition to despotism. But from the beginning, it expresses the imperialism of the signifier that produces, it signifies as effects that are the more effective and necessary as they escape knowing, and as they owe all to their imminent cause. Occasionally, it still happens young dogs will call for a return to the despotic signifier without exegesis or interpretation. Well, the law, however, wants to explain what it signifies to assert an independence of its signified against the despot, says the law. For the dogs, according to Kafka's observations, want desire to be firmly wedded to the law in pure detachment and elevation of the death instinct, rather than to hear it is true. Hypocritical doctors explain what it all means. But all that, the development of the democratic signified, or the wrapping, we read this. Did I go backwards? God damn it. Jack, you didn't stop me.
I thought it was to continue the discussion. I don't know,
We'll continue it. Nevertheless, forms part of the same question, sometimes open, sometimes barred, the same extraction, a repressive machinery that always moves us away from desiring machines, for there has never been but one state. The question, what is the use of that, fades more and more, and disappears in the fog of pessimism, nihilism, nada nada. The move that has happened, the nature of laws, the nature of the signifiers, the way that the written word has been taken as the despot has taken power, all of these things move the death instinct to this transcendent position above people that is sort of oppressing on them. The position now people are in is that of the passive peasant, having to discern, having to interpret the law as best they can. There can never be a direct law. Should just by nature, it can't say the literal wall at this corner and this street must always be kept clean. It needs to say the walls of the kingdom will be kept clean. What does walls of the kingdom mean? Does it mean walls inside of every house, walls of the kingdom, public owned? These things have to stay just wide enough that they have room, that there's constant threat, but defined enough that they can be knowable. And this odd thing, as he says, Kafka spends a lot of time on this. Bureaucrats love this shit. But this is this play of the rules, the way the rules are, the way the state operates, the way that power has to disperse itself through this. The question that doesn't get asked is, well, what's the use of that? It doesn't matter. There's nothing's behind that. It's not about use. It's about what it does. And what it does is create the passive peasant, as they talk about it here. So the death instinct, when elevated, moves into this odd position, disconnected, no longer now part of desiring production, now brought above it, now shifted into a different place. That's my answer, JK.
I'm not sure about the passive peasant bit though. Like,
I mean, that's what they
I-
literally do say that.
can you show me the sentence?
Passivity must now become the virtue of the subjects attached to the despotic body.
Okay, where's the peasant though?
I mean, that's the, all right, fair, but that's who they're talking about.
Well, this is why I'm pointing this out. Like, remember, the state includes the despot, it includes the aristocrats, and it includes the peasants,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is a passivity that's oddly democratic. So, like, the doctors may explain the law, but I mean, they're still hypocrites, right? It doesn't make them any more active than than the other passive folks.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm not necessarily intending not to include the elite in that. I am probably overstating when I say passive peasants, but there is a difference in their passivity, but it's fair. It's fair. That's a fair point.
Yeah, I'm fine with there being a difference. I just want to keep it because it's, you know, this kind of point about the state, like, he, I think it's important to recognize that in this pyramid are the people like the peasants, right?
Hmm.
Or I call them the people of the earth. However you want to think about them, just because the state in that sense is, paradoxically inclusive, despite it relying on exclusive disjunction, right? There's an encompassing feature to it. Um, and I think that's kind of a unique thing about this theory, right? Is that they're not qualifying the state as, say, like a central authority. They're qualifying it in a more like, it's kind of like an inclusive empire sense, right?
The
It includes
superstructure.
the farmers, it includes the artisans, it includes the wealthy, includes the king, and so forth. Uh,
Well, I mean, that is for them, they don't want us to be considering the state sort of, I mean, really almost how Marx and others did this idea that there were things that had to come in place where that the state sort of showed up all at once. It's important to consider the fact that the state, because of its organization like this and being built like this, existed in potentiality for the earth socius or the primitive tribes, that it was always there waiting, almost that there is that potentiality just because this is the nature of sort of organization at this scale.
yeah, I mean, with the primitive, right? Like what's interesting about this, right? And this is where you get some of this transcendence, right? Like the whole vengeance to cruelty dynamic, right? The passive versus the active, right? The retributive versus the cruel. So in the sense of like the despotic socius and the primitive socius into a conflict, right? So you get a tension between those two rather than say like a tension between like an ego and or an id, right? Becomes the two socii, um, bumping against each other, and that's where the state comes in, right? Because the state, on top of that tension, right, on top of the codes, the
Hmm.
state overcodes it.
Yeah. Well, and it's
So
also
it's funny,
important
right?
because the
But
nature of law here, they don't really spend a lot of time. They're not going to distinguish between a liberal democracy and an oppressive totalitarian government. The state is the state. It's the nature of this beast, and here's how these things work. That's the other part of what they're doing that's really important because this paragraph we're about to read, which is really where we're going to start today, dives into the nature of how laws work, and by creating the laws in this process, the nature of a power society. Here is how these elements build, and by the way, we haven't really gotten rid of them. That it's still the same core thing underneath all of it.
So it would be
yeah,
good to identify the agent of overcoding is the state, the despotic, the despot, and the death instinct. I mean, those are those on one side, and the law, right? The agent of overcoding, the state, and the despot are all the same identity, right? All in terms of, if you want to talk about identification, that's what that's what they are, right?
They're
You
parts
could
of
define
they're parts of the imperial socius.
exactly right. Parts of the imperial associates. Okay.
Yeah, and
The
again, it's better to consider it all as machinery rather than identity, because identity is
Sure.
going to be real difficult, as we said and talked about in the last couple of weeks. The debt, like King George, isn't the despot really they're talking about. He played that role or had that position, but it wasn't really him that was doing things or had this process. There's something else going on, and that's that sort of element of the socius. The same way that it's not so much when we talk about the earth under the earth socius. It's not that it's some animated anima god. Oh, the earth goddess. It's nothing like that. It's a different. It's where and what is responsible for production or co-opting production or quasi cause of production. That element or that thing, and that the despot, that grand thing is that sort of central element. So it's all of these pieces. And the death instinct by being raised, because again, how the law works and how these things get threatened, how power dynamics operate, they can't operate locally. You can't allow the slightest bit of desire to go outside of it. You could actually have a decent amount of excess under the earth socius. They'd blow off a good amount of steam in various sacrificial ceremonies, various feasts, various orgies, various hunting parties, various, whatever it is. There's a lot of different ways that you could blow off a lot of excess, but you couldn't even have that under the despot has to take all and get all. And so if locally you just let people deal with things themselves instead of having this grand law, it would shatter the entire project. The point of the project is that singular point that's in control that everything is done for. And that's the nature of why law became what it is. And this next paragraph, which I'm going to push into, unless Jack, you got something.
Well, I'd be careful on the singular point piece, but I mean, I would say you want to be careful not to over vocalize those different parts, right? Like, remember, the despot has a place in the state, but the state kind of includes more than just that. Say the figure of the despot, or say like the party of it, because it can be a democracy, right? And in fact, what is the state if not? Well, what is democracy without talking about a form of state that is kind of larger than a single person, right?
Yep.
Kind of has to be beyond that. So I mean, like, to kind of delineate them, right? You have the despot as social body, you have the state as including the despot, which is really interesting, and you have the death instinct or the death drive as part of part of the syntheses, and possible to use and misuse within those syntheses, right? And you have the law as a question of the disjunctive synthesis, right? At least at large, that's where it gets couched.
So we're talking about if you're talking about the signifier, right, and the signified, the despot is identified with the signifier, right?
The despot becomes a bit of a master signifier. And we're about to get into sort of the nature of, this is a lot of their critique of Lacan. For Lacan, you can't have any signification chain or meaning chain or symbolic chain that works without a master signifier. It's the nature of a master signifier and the nature of signification. And they're not really going to disagree with that. The challenge they're going to make, because for Lacan, the master signifier is necessary for desire. And they're going to say, no. It's necessary for signification and for desire to work in a power-based sort of political system, a power-based sort of social structure. But that's not based to desire. And that's kind of what we're going to start to see their critique. So master signifier is about to come up in the next paragraph. I kind of want to move to it. So we're going to do that because it's been a half hour and I actually haven't started today's reading, which is just irresponsible as shit of me. The order of law, as it appears in the imperial formation and as it will evolve later, indeed have something in common: the indifference to designation. It is in the nature of the law to signify without designating anything. The law does not designate anything or anybody. The democratic conception of law will make this into a criterion. The complex relationship of designation, as we have seen it elaborated in the system of primitive connotation with its interplay of voice, graphism, and eye, here disappears in the new relationship of barbarian subordination. How could designation subsist when the sign has ceased to be a position of desire, in order to become this imperial sign, a universal castration that welds desire to law? It is the crushing of the old code. It is the new relationship of signification. It is the necessity of this new relationship established in the overcoding process that refers designations to the arbitrary, or that lets them subsist in the form of bricks held over from the old system. Why is it that linguists are constantly rediscovering the truths of the despotic age? And finally, could it be that this arbitrariness of designations, as the reverse side of a necessity of signification, does not bear only on the despot's subjects, nor even on his servants, but on the despot himself, his dynasty, and his name? The people do not know the emperor is reigning, and there exist doubts regarding even the name of this dynasty. This would mean that the death instinct is even more deeply rooted in the state than thought, and that latency not only befalls the subject of a state, but is also at work in the highest machinery of the apparatus. The revenge becomes that the subjects against the despot. The revenge becomes that of the subjects against the despot. In the latency system of terror, what is no longer active, enacted, or reacted to, this instinct for freedom, forcibly made latent, pushed back and repressed, incarcerated within and finally able to discharge and vent itself only on itself. That very thing is now resente. The eternal resentment of the subject answers to the eternal vengeance of the despots. The inscription is resente when it is no longer enacted or reacted to. When the deterritorialized sign becomes a signifier, a formidable quantity of reaction passes into the latent state. All the resonance and all the retention change in volume and time, after the event. Vengeance and resentment, not the beginning of justice, to be sure, but its becoming and its destiny in the imperial formation as Nietzsche analyzes it. And according to his prophecy, wouldn't the state itself be the dog that wants to die? But that also is reborn from its ashes. For it is this whole constellation of the new alliance, the imperialism of the signifier, the metaphoric or metonymic necessity of the signifieds, with the arbitrary of the designations, that ensures the maintenance of the system, sees to it that the name is succeeded by another name, one dynasty by another, without changing the signifieds and without a collapse of the wall of the signifier. This is why the order of latency in the African, Chinese, Egyptian, and other empires was that of rebellions and constant secessions, and not that of revolution. Here again, death will have to be felt from within, but it will have to come from without. So much said in this paragraph. Fuzzy words, fuzzy laws. When we talk about the connotation, it's one of the first things they go over. The complex relationship of designation. Designation is the important word for this paragraph to just go over. Something designates something. What does that mean? What does that sign designate? What is its signifier designating? When you're talking about something that's connotative, like it was as they described under the Earth Socius, when something's connotative with, as they say, the interplay of voice, graphism, and eye, the thing, we'll use the example of the gourd. The gourd isn't just a gourd. It's also not just a symbol of fertility. There's so much connotative nature in the eyes that are looking at it as it's carved, me seeing it, the eye that is seeing it, where I'm seeing it and when, on what body, and how it's drawn. All of these things don't create a single answer, but connotations of meaning that kind of shifts depending on the connotation. So as such, you have this really odd sort of relationship where just how something is looked at can actually change what it means. That goes away with the despot. The despot shows up, the law shows up, and suddenly the old code that had this connotation has this new relationship of signification. No longer connotative, now significative. Now something designates something more arbitrary, but somewhat more, at least seeming exacting. Just like we saw with the Akkadian and water with the letter A. The A is water. That's water? Fuck, that's water. Now it's water. The designations become more arbitrary and shifting. What do I mean by water? What does he mean by water? Does he mean literally H2O? Does he mean drinkable water, seawater? Does he mean potable water? How about sewage water? Water from the stream uphill, downhill. Water is open to a lot, but it's signifying. It has a relationship of signification that's particular, which is so odd, but it's the way that the master signifier works. We have to discover what is meant by the person saying it, or the sentence. What does it mean? What are they trying to signify? I guess would be the way to put it. And so there's this really fucking weird thing of who wrote it? How do we know? How do I, as a subject, determine anything? And couple this with, they call it latency, but the example they use is, I'm 99% sure it's Kafka, the Chinese Wall, the village that they go by, and because it takes so long for a message to get from the central kingdom, where the king lives and the emperor lives, and he sends out a message, but it takes like 20 years to get across fucking all of China. So by the time it gets there, they actually don't really know who's actually giving the orders and who's actually sent this. Is the guy that they remember dead? Who, like, that almost doesn't matter. There's something deeper here than just that one guy. There's something in the death instinct in the state that's so much more than we thought. And that is where we start pushing into how we start having this odd interplay of resentment as they talk about it. And it's worth maybe going over a bit, but this is how they start making their move, as we said, between how a subject is going to deal with signification, and how signification is going to change how we sort of interact and deal with words, even themselves, because it starts completely fucking us pretty much on every level, just in how we even talk. Is that a fair way to put it, Jack? What do you got for me? Nothing? There you are.
Um, yeah, I mean, so like with codification, right? Like I used to think they were doing Lacan. Now, this reading, I realized it's more correspondence and like Frege.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, like you have that in the primitive, and that's sort of your codification, right? So it's a way that words and things get placed in this discussion of voice and graphism, right? So that altogether, right, the straight shot through that is them talking about how a disjunction functions. So it becomes a question of the align and affiliative undertaken through Frege, which is kind of the nuance of the whole thing. That all goes into conflict with overcoding, right? So signification comes into conflict with correspondence, basically. And that's the conflict between, the new disjunction and the primitive disjunction, if you like.
So are they talking about Lacan's symbolic order that is based on the master signifier, and that words, how you use the symbolic order, um, which is a language that the meanings of each word, each symbol, has to be aligned with the signifier.
They're starting to
No,
play towards that. They haven't quite made that comment. They will in about 2 or 3 paragraphs, I
right.
think.
Yeah, there's difference between designation and signification. Yeah, I think that's your point, right?
Yeah,
In
I
the
mean,
primitive, yeah,
again, for Lacan, desire and signification in language necessitates a master signifier. Like, you can't have any of those things unless you have that sort of singular point of truth, the law, whatever it is. And they have a line in here that is very clearly at like Lacan and a lot of sort of linguists around that, where they make the comment, is it in this paragraph or the previous? Like, where they're like, where's the linguist line? That they keep discovering, one sec. Why is it that linguists are constantly rediscovering the truths of the despotic age? It's a fucking really good line. And they mean a lot by that what linguists are talking about when they talk about signification, the signifier-signified relationship, they're not revealing truths like of language, but they're revealing truths of the despotic age. This is how the power structure sort of worked inside of even language. And so there's a little bit of you're not quite get a little bit of a jab of, yeah, you're not actually getting at the sort of bedrock of things. You're actually talking about, here's how power structures work in language. And that's what linguists keep constantly rediscovering. And that's kind of they do it in that sly way where they're like, aha, but then they make their comment. Finally, could it be this arbitrariness of designations as the reverse side of the necessity of signification does not bear only on the subjects nor on the servants, but on the despot himself, his dynasty, and his name? It goes all the way up. The master signifier itself is also encompassed by the master signifier, which is, again, fucking with a good amount of Lacan also. They're making some pretty hard comments here. Not things I want to go over because Jesus Christ, but there's a lot of little commentary here throughout. You can feel Guattari, smiling a little.
Right. So they're saying that the law, as he's describing here, is a system that signifies, right? Signifies as opposed to designates, because in designation there's a kind of connotation in the use of language and so forth. But in under law there is no designation.
Yeah, the necessity of the new relationship established in the overcoding process is the phrasing they use. And that necessity comes about, again, because of that threat of death. You have the two sides. You have the ressentiment and you have the state of terror and the ressentiment, the vengeance of the despot and the ressentiment of the people or the subjects. Which may even include the despot, by the way, as Jack pointed out. So like there's this constant interaction between the two within the power structures that signification is necessary for. Because again, stuff got to keep moving. Production got to keep happening. How does production happen here? Well, it happens because you get an order to do something. What does that order mean? Well, you've got to divine it effectively. And this becomes no longer you trying to find your place or trying to actualize yourself under a despot. You can't do that. You're at whatever whims are happening, and that includes the despot, because there's kind of no answer. The line they have, the eternal resentment of the subject answers the eternal vengeance of the despot. The inscription is resenti when it is no longer enacted or reenacted to. When we no longer have sort of those steps and it's literally just, repressed. It becomes this resenti because it's not about reacting to it or enacting to it. It's just about the statement of it. When the deterritorialized sign becomes signifier, this formidable quantity of reaction moves into a latent state. You can't really do anything about it. It's latent. How to phrase that, because the use of latent throughout the rest of this paragraph is tough to sort of get as a thing.
Do they mean latent as opposed to spontaneous?
Well, I mean, it's Freud, right? Like it's something that's like latency is like something that's kind of underneath or behind something
Yeah,
that only appears
waiting.
to come out. Well, not
I know, not
exactly, right?
waiting.
Like
It's not exactly waiting.
it's something like, like you can use it in an example, right? It's like someone who, the desire is to say like do something misogynist, right? And they compliment someone, and underneath the compliment is the misogynist
So they're a
desire.
latent misogynist.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean it's
No, and
there,
that's
but
actually the
like
best way to talk about it because
it's
it's
like silently pronounced almost. That's
Would that
the
be something like sublimation?
no
not
sublimation
necessarily.
sublimation would be the desexualization. This is much more that
Latent maybe would be virtual, or as opposed to substantial, something like emergent quality instead of directly found quality. It would be also as well as underlying, right?
Yeah, I think underlying is
Underlying,
going to be the word I think I'll stick with too, but it's tougher to vocalize. It's going to be important because as we talk about latent desire, which is what's happening here. We're talking about these elements. The reaction passes into its latent state. The latency of this is going to be the same way that Oedipus eventually is going to be trapping desire. And we're not there yet, so don't jump, JK, but it is this thing that is happening where desire is, when we talk about desire underneath trapped, repressed, it's latent means that it's not just doing nothing. That's kind of the other part of latency for Freud, is it's not like, I'm latent homosexual desires, which is a big Freudian thing. I am pronounced them. I'm not doing being gay, but I'm latently so. There's things showing up that are maybe unintentional, maybe secondary. Freud talked about latent neuroticism, latent perversion. These are things that are showing their face, even if I'm not acutely aware of them or even conscious of them or trying. Latent reactions, which is what's happening here. The resonance, the retention in this, the resentment is boiling up, and it's showing its face in ways, but it never makes it over the edge. It never becomes a burst of desire. As they say specifically, the way that it actually works is the order of latency in African Chinese Egyptian, that of rebellions and constant secessions, but not revolution. And that's the kind of important thing to sort of think about. The moves that we're talking about here, the latency, it's not a revolution that ends up happening. People rebel, you may say. Sure, they rise up, they strike down their leader, and then put someone else in charge, like over and over and over and over and over, kind of everywhere. This will happen a lot, but it's not revolutionary. The system isn't being killed, not from within. Death is felt within, for sure, but it has to come from without. It needs to be an externalized thing to do actual death, to actually cause revolution, because of the latency of this, the latency caused by the system. I think that would be the way I'm probably rambling too long, but I think that's kind of the way to talk through it. Latency is a fun one for this one, though.
So it would be very similar to libidinal charge, right? Like some kind of libidinal charge that gets reinvested.
That's what I read when they say the sign, when they say the deterritorialized sign becomes a signifier. A formidable quantity of reaction passes into a latent state. All the resonance and retention change in volume and time. This, I'm reading that as a libidinal desire or some form of that. Jack, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what I read that part as.
I mean, yeah, it's all libido. It's all libid. I mean, it's all
It's
desire,
it's
right?
all desire, but like I think specifically they're talking there about desire being becoming latent, almost trapped, but we're not quite at trapped yet. Again, capitalism gets that
Well,
point.
yeah, I mean, look at the active passive tension, right? Like that's really kind of the key to all of this. You know, the vengeance that is revolutionary is a kind of passive vengeance, right? And you can think about this too in terms of its infinitude, right? So it's ever expanding, and yet it's, you know, like with resentment, right? It's this thing that you didn't do the thing, so to speak, and you know, the feelings of not doing it take on a magnitude, right? And they get expressed in the things that you are doing or in your emotions, right? Like speaking very broadly here, right? It's passive and like amplifying, right? And it doesn't necessarily go away, but it's not in kind of the finite blots that they've been talking about, right? So like, you know, it
Very
comes out
much.
in Freud
Yeah.
too with like trauma, right? For Freud, trauma can be latent, and you know, an abuse once can manifest in somebody's actions, right? It's a similar point here, right? It's something's there that's coming out, but it's not taking the active role. It's kind of passively coming out.
Well, and
It's
it can only come
like
out,
you said, underlying.
and it can only come out particularly. It's one of the things, again, we haven't made it fully to Oedipus yet. So the very complex thing that Oedipus is, where we have the God damn it. The repressed representative, the repressed representation, and the displaced represented. We don't have all those pieces yet. We've only really got the two. We've got basically royal incest being the repressed representation. So that the repressed representation is that of the despot, therefore is the vengeance outwards of the despot. And then there's the sort of, in return, there is the resentment of the subjects back upwards. And that really basically takes form of the despot striking downwards or being overthrown by the subjects. But there's no third element here. We're not quite at that place because, again, Oedipus hasn't fully formed. So this is kind of why we're stuck in that back and forth. It's why you end up in a place of, because the system of production or what claims production doesn't change, when the subjects overthrow, they're not doing so revolutionarily. They're doing a rebellion. It's out of resentment. It's out of hatred of that despot, not despots or not the system, not in the same way. It's why you end up with, we were doing a reading of Spinoza, and during Spinoza's time, there was the orange. It always sounds stupid when I fucking say it, but the oranges in Denmark, I want to say. God damn it, I'm stupid with this. I never get the countries right. But the entire sort of oligarchy was overthrown, and democracy was put in power, but people didn't really want that. So they fucking brutally murdered the brothers who actually brought democracy and reinstalled the monarch. Like rebellion, resentment, and then a new despot is the cycle of this, because we don't have that next step, which is this displaced, which is the repressed representative, which is the last step of Oedipus. So it's, again, how resentment sits, how the power structure sits is very important in this.
No, I think we want to back up. Like for me, it's not even like an Oedipal problem. It's more like, so I
I
mean,
mean the
this
Dutch.
resentment,
Thank
right?
you.
Like,
God damn it. I mean the Dutch. Yes, thank you. Sorry. Remke corrected me.
cool.
I'm an idiot. Don't ever listen to me for anything.
I mean, you're fine, man. I'm misremember countries too, but like going back, right? So like it's important to understand what's passive, what's active here, to understand what's latent. And like when they talk about vengeance and resentment, right? Which, since they're talking about subjects, it sounds like this is getting into like tribute and the third synthesis now, especially because it's eternal. But this passive piece, right? It's terror, it's overcoding, right? It's a transcendent use of the disjunction, right? So
Mhm.
like, if we try to put this together, right? The Saussurian semiotics, right? The signifier signified piece, the overcoding, right? That's what's passive here. So the thing that's latent, the thing that's like there without being kind of concretely there, but still coming out, right? That passivity is in the extended filiations and the new alliances, right? That's what's really latent, and it's latent to the coded flows, right? So what's funny about this is I agree. I usually think of latency as something underlying, but for Deleuze and Guattari, right, like latency is almost on top of it because it's coming through the overcoding into these flows of correspondence, right? So you have the correspondence intention with the signify with the signs, and the signs are bringing in this latency to it
Mhm.
through passivity, right?
Well, and again, the other thing, the reason I do bring up, and I may be jumping slightly ahead, I'm not terribly far ahead. We're almost done with the section, but um, these pieces don't go away. Again, it's an important thing to keep remembering. With parts of this are still parts of what was existing during the Earth Socius. Parts of this are still existing today. We still have state power. We still have this threat of death. Things operate differently. The overall machine is slightly different, but these things are very much things I think we can understand and sort of grapple with slightly differently, but generally But this ain't gone away. We still have states. We still have laws as these things sort of work.
So would the word latency also can be defined as delayed? Because you're saying it's there, but it's just delayed. It takes time for it to be manifested.
That is why Freud
Kind of.
used it. Like it was the idea was it was always thought of as like this delayed, becoming that eventually your latent homosexuality, you're eventually going to come out just latently. So we're a little early kind of thing. I don't know if they totally mean it in that sense, but that is kind of where it came from. Jack, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, kind of in the spirit of delay, right? Like it's, you know, again, right? Like it's think about it in terms of like the theater of terror and the theater of cruelty, right? The theater of terror is producing a passive terror, right? And we've seen this with like the eye in its sense of, it's almost panoptical, the way it's watching, right? You know, it's almost like that kind of, it's that kind of terror, right? And it's a terror coming through the new alliance and the extended filiation, right? And that's what's passive and bumping against the active cruelty, right? The active cruelty of the primitive, whereby the codes, you know, they accomplish the correspondence by kind of striking at the bodies, and this is where it all starts to flow into voluptus. But I want to stay kind of within your question.
I think it's time to move to the next paragraph.
Well, Val had something.
Oh, Val, please.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask, maybe it's a stupid question, but this latency is the body without organs?
No.
No? Okay.
No. Uh, BWO different than this. Yeah, I'm gonna say no.
Okay.
Jack.
I agree with you. I see where you're coming from there in the sense that desiring production would be marginalized, but the latent, again, it's like again, I usually think of it as underlying, but for them it's overcoding, right? The latency is about overcoding and what it's doing to the other syntheses. Like this resentiment language, right? They're going into how, the eternal return, right? The eternal resentiment. A very clever pun on Nietzsche. Uh, it's in social production, qua social production here. Has implications for the BWO, but it's not. I don't think it's the BWO itself.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's also this is something I would probably argue this sits much more in sort of how social production impinges on desiring production, like the entirety of the process. The BWO as a thing, there's a way to look at it as though it was always part of the process. It enacts and works differently throughout all of it and how it's inscribed upon, how it works. But latency itself, the BWO doesn't really have that. It's more the arrangement of things and the sort of metaformation of things that we then recognize that sort of plays. So it's definitely a little different than latency.
Yeah,
Also really far earlier in the process too. I think this latency is a lot later, but maybe not. I don't know.
the big thing is not to get too hung up on the term latent, right? It's to understand how the passive and active, how terror and cruelty are interacting with each other here.
The next paragraph. The founders of empires caused everything to pass into a latent state. They invented vengeance and incited resentment, that counter vengeance. And yet Nietzsche says about them what he has already said about the primitive system. It was not in their midst that the bad conscience, this ugly growth, i.e., Oedipus, took root and began to grow. It is simply that one more step has been taken in that direction. Oedipus, bad conscience, interiority, they made it possible. What does Nietzsche mean, this man who dragged Caesar along with him as a despotic signifier, along with its two signifieds, his sister and his mother, and who felt their weight grow heavier as he drew nearer to madness? It is true that Oedipus begins its cellular ovular migration in the system of imperial representation from being at first the displaced representative desire. It becomes the repressing representation itself. The impossible has become possible. The unoccupied limit now finds itself occupied by the despot. Oedipus has received its name, the club-footed despot, committing double incest through overcoating with his sister and his mother as body representation subjected to verbal representation. Moreover, Oedipus is in the process of establishing each of the formal operations that will make it all possible. The extrapolation of a detached object, the double bind of overcoating or royal incest, the bi-univocalization, application, and linearization of the chain between masters and slaves, the introduction of the law into desire and of desire into the law, the terrible latency with its afterward or after the event. All the parts of the five paralogisms thus seem to be ready. Yeah, that's a fucking really tight paragraph. Once in a while, they do that. I like, that's just a clean one. That's nice. All the parts seem to be ready. We're not there yet. I mean, I kind of was saying this in the last paragraph anyway, so.
Right. So how is he? He's associating the bad conscience with Oedipus, right? Could you elaborate that a little bit?
Bad conscience, guilt, Oedipal types of guilt, the way Deleuze spoke of them, the way Nietzsche spoke of them, the way Marx spoke of things, necessitates sort of another element. It need all five of these, and we talked through all five paralogisms a while back, but they literally just go over all five of them here. Bad conscience is not Oedipus, like they're not exactly the same thing, but the Oedipal triangulation, the process that Oedipalization has us go through, the thing Oedipus sort of represents at large, the how to say, representational thinking, with the ego at the center and with the five paralogisms sort of playing it out, yields bad conscience. Bad conscience. Is it conscience? I never pronounced the N properly in that. It yields bad conscience, this ugly growth. And this is where we start to see these things happen. It's their argument sort of sets up all of these things, as I've said. So to me, they're talking about the same thing. They're referring to that same thing. It's not resentment, because resentment is just counter vengeance. These are, again, pieces that are laying up. But now we have this other unique thing that's starting to play in, and how Oedipus finally shows up, how these things work. But again, we're not there yet. No, we're not there. Even though all the pieces seem to start being in place and we've got all these things. But again, it's not quite that last step. Because it's not the representative of desire itself. It's not the representative of desire quite yet.
But it is so is he implying that the despot is somehow responsible for this bad growth, bad conscience, and this ugly growth?
Yeah, well, as much as he's saying that the Earth's socius is as well. The savage socius gave us the displaced represented. It was the base of sort of how these things were. There's displaced represented because of the nature of how we sort of had positive interactions, and so we didn't really have a prohibition, not really. The way that the prohibition against incest works, where we have this sort of, you're not allowed to do this thing, didn't really have that. They still didn't do the thing, but it wasn't because they had this outright prohibition as we exist now, or as parents teach kids things, or how capitalism uses rules and axiomatics to control us. that instead this displaced represented this idea of incest was sort of this fuzzy thing placed just beyond that. It's not that you didn't want it, it's that you didn't care, sort of secondarily. And this moved that ultimately, as we got into despotism, moved it to repressing representation. And this, because the repressing representation of the despot quite literally is that of someone who can commit incest overall. They have total control. They have the ability to do that. And with that, the repressed representative is the demand that I don't, the knowledge that I don't have that power, that no one has that power except for the despot. The despot controls and has the totality of that. And that interaction, that's again, the vengeance outward, resentment upwards. And ultimately Oedipus and incest need to become the representative of desire. And this is the next step. We're just not there yet. So these are the things that sort of lead up to these elements. Yeah, Jack?
Um,
I saw you unmute.
yeah. So I mean, the question was. I think the question was, does the despot bring about Oedipus? And yeah, I agree with you. The answer is not. The answer is no, in the sense of Oedipus is occupying all three, right? What's tricky about these chapters is Deleuze and Guattari. They'll talk about the primitive, and right, like it doesn't have Oedipus as all three. It has Oedipus as one, but it's not quite Oedipus. It's incest, right? And they play this univocal, equivocal game that's really tricky. Jumping into this paragraph we're in now. So I mean, like, again, right? They're talking about how if we mean Oedipus in the sense of, a full occupying all three spots of the fourth paralogism, right? What's unique about the despotic is you have two of the three. I believe you're still dealing with the germinal influx as the that which stands in for desire, though. What's interesting beyond that, so there's two things at the end here, right? The impossible has become possible. The unoccupied limit now finds itself occupied by the despot. So that's the tension between the despotic and the primitive, right? Incest is not only the disfigured representative of desire for the primitive, it's also the limit of the primitive socius. And I almost made a pun there. By virtue of that, it is necessary in understanding the whole falling back on production and the intensive versus extensive uses of the disjunctive synthesis, right? And that is the limits of the primitive that now give way to the despotic, right? So the despotic not only takes over that kind of limit, right, that external limit, but it now reconstitutes, or rather now constitutes its own limits. Pushing into the last bit of this paragraph, right, where Deleuze and Guattari kind of end this, at least where I'm going to focus on for a minute, is they get to the fifth paralogism. So what's interesting about this is at this point, not only are they suggesting all five, but they're talking now about how you have the problem of Oedipus as an actual that kind of retrogressively explains production, right? As opposed to seeing Oedipus as something virtual that has to be actualized, right? The inverse. And it's interesting that they've chosen to bring that up here.
I mean, they're basically just saying, look, all the parts have shown up. But again, because a big critique of theirs, as I said earlier, they're not saying it. Lacan has a lot of pieces behind how linguistics works. A lot of linguists have, and some of the people that they're very much working with in terms of how semiotics happen, all the way through to like a lot of people have done extraordinary work that have sort of built up what they're using as the paralogisms, what they're using as the way, and they don't want to just say like these things only existed. They don't only exist in capital. They existed in these positions, and here's why. And again, they give very specific movement that happens inside of the despotic socius, the double incest, for example, by excess, with his sister and mother as representations of bodies subjected to verbal representation. That's the thing that sort of matters there, that's driving that. The double bind of overcoding, biunivocalization, extrapolation of the detached object, the after effect because of latency. They're just like, look, all these things, remember, we went over these. They're like, check it out. Look, all these pieces are here, but we are not at the psychoanalytic Oedipus yet. And that's kind of what they want to be talking about. The thing they want to start getting at is that it's not necessarily, and this is where it's really interesting to me, the despot and the state are not one thing. I think this is a thing you see actually even a lot in philosophical circles, where historical circles, where people talk about, oh, kings, now we're in the age of enlightenment where we've got democracy and capitalism. So it's a different everything. And so it's like this cut in line in history where it's like, that stuff was there, this stuff's here. And they're like, no, there's a lot of overlapping machines happening here. And that's part of the reason that the state and the despot, all of these things sort of coming together, like the state, which continues to fucking exist, but the way that it operates interacted with the despot specifically in this way to create this particular type of latency. And latency, this after image, is important. Like, they want to separate that because as we get rid of the despot, which we do, but we replace it with capital, which we do, the state doesn't go away. These pieces are still here. So what they're trying to do is get us to not think of this sort of weird staged setup of history where it's like, oh, there's primitive times, and then once we had agriculture in the state, there was despots for a while, and now we have capitalism and liberal democracy. That's the three socialists they're talking about. It's like, no, they're not talking about that. They're talking about the way that these power systems interact, production interacts with power, specifically in the despot, and now how power continues into capital, and power and these things interact, because we have a different form of production operating now. And so that's, to me, the thing they're trying to do is break apart the sort of concept that the Enlightenment or the sort of push in the 1700s at some point gave us a new world, and all of the new things are new. And it's like, no. Arachne, I'll get to you. Jack, does that make sense?
I mean, you might.
As I'm describing the reason that they're bringing him up here.
I mean, I don't have any thoughts on the Enlightenment.
I'm not saying you do, but my point is they're trying to give a very universal history where all of these pieces are constantly in interplay. And when one falls away, other things are staying there. It's not that the whole system collapses. The common historiographic, I mean, it's shitty history, but again, it's the way people talk about it, that like, oh, after we got rid of kings, we're in the Enlightenment, so all of it's different. It's like, no, these pieces are still showing up. The state's still here. These other things are here. It isn't that the entirety of the power structure or production structure disappeared. It's that new things were introduced, but a lot of those pieces came through, and it created and continued a lot of the same sort of oppression, repression, and resentment. And specifically, lo and behold, we have all 5 of the paralogisms showing up that happened over time at varying times in the interaction between state and despot.
Yeah, okay, I think I see where you're coming from now. I mean, yeah, it's constructive, right? So, I mean, it's not an annihilative break, right? It's a break in which things are simply reconstituted by changing the conditions of production.
Yeah, I can see that.
'Cause, I mean, capital precedes capitalism. It wasn't capitalism, right? Labor precedes capitalism, but what it does changes altogether, right?
Yes. Yes, I think so. Arachne asks, explain the relation between overcoding and biunivocalization of phrases and expressions. Okay. Let me start with asking why you want me to talk about how they're related, because I can do that, but they are two different operants as two different paralogisms and things. So to start there, do you know that, or do you see them as being part of the same? And I can go over either way. Ah, so overcoding is actually kind of complex to just dive into. Might be the easiest way. Let me see what I've got. One second, sorry. 2 seconds. Do you want to go for it, Jack, while I'm trying to find a good explanation for overcoding?
Sure. I mean, overcoding is a question of, so I mean, it's the Saussurian linguistics, right? Applied to the second synthesis. So you're just discussing how codification in the primitive, right, in terms of correspondence, right, is in conflict with a transcendent use of the second synthesis. And that transcendent use is going to use the Saussurian signs, right? It's going to use that to basically work with the new alliance and the extended filiation, right? And at a base level, that's kind of it, right? So it places those parcels, we'll say, of disjunction over the disjunctions of the primitive, right? And this is where you get the tension between the finite and the infinite. It's it's biunivocal in the sense of like overcoding's working with a misuse of the second synthesis. So right, it's biunivocalizing by virtue of using S1, right, of creating transcendent uses of the disjunction. So like this tension between affiliation of the earth and an extended filiation of the despotic, right? For me, it's biunivocalized in the sense that those two things are put into a relationship with each other, and it's kind of by virtue of the transcendent use that they take on a kind of roundedness, right? They're still in conflict, but for the despotic, right, it's this point about vengeance and latency. What comes out in the flows, so to speak, is going to be the overcoding as far as the despotic socius is concerned. It's
Yeah,
still taking vengeance, right? It still cares about the codification. Um, but it's working through over codification.
yeah. To try to simplify it, I think how I talk about overcoding is overwriting code. I think that's kind of even again. You're talking about Saussure. The idea of a despot comes in, and you have all of your social codes as a small tribe that you've had, and there's a lot of things that means. It's graphisms, it's how you sort of talk to each other, it's what you do for your day, the social codes of who gets to marry who gets to eat first, who's the hunter. All coding happens socially. Despot comes in and overwrites the codes, and he does so particularly. He said, now all of you are hunters. Now all of you are granite cutters. Now all of you are doing these things. It's overcoding. It's all the codes. It's all the aspects of life. It's not just the simple things I've said. It's like intensely everything. The thing is, the challenge that the despot has is that he can't just like, if I just were to go to a tribe and go, hey guys, all of you are fucking doing that thing, they would not, one, not understand me, two, not give a shit, and three, go about their fucking day. If I were to start killing them, they would start to listen to me. Because of this, now I kill them if they disobey. They don't super speak my social language. They don't really know what I mean when I say things. It's not like let's say I'm a conquistador in South America. Let's say I'm Christopher Columbus. Great example. Guy who totally really is a good example for this. Hey, bring me all your gold. We don't understand you. Okay, I'm going to cut your head off. Cut your head off. Bring me your gold. What the fuck does this fucking guy want? I don't know. He's give him shit. So the need for them to understand what someone means, and that there is a meaning, that there is no way to sort of disagree with that. This shifts the way that the polyvocal words can be spoken. If you've ever had a fight with someone in a relationship or a long heated argument where maybe you said things you didn't mean, you totally meant in the moment, but you meant contextually in the moment, the connotations of it were there, but then said out of context, holy shit, you sound like a monster. Or you sound like a weirdo or a coward or a passive loser. But in the moment it made sense and your partner thought it made sense. But now afterwards, that the change in the connotation of the meaning, this is polyvocal. It's who's saying it, where, when, the connotation matters, and you kind of take it as you take it and you move through. But the written word and spoken word, even now, I say, give me gold, or I say, you're a man, you're a woman, whatever it is, the need to sort of have that on high authority on what that means, it biunivocalizes. Goes from polyvocal, which can be many meanings, many parts, to bi. By one means two-way, but it means one-to-one. It's from on high to me, master to servant. Boom, boom, biunivocalization, not poly. And that setup puts us in a place where I'm now interpreting. So these things have a relationship because the nature of power structures under the despotic and under the state necessitate an overcoding of local, laws and ideas and thoughts and art and all those things to bring them in line with everyone else. So that way there's a general uniformity of understanding, because otherwise I'll cut your head off. And that collapses the polyvocal into the biunivocal. These things come together that way. Does that make sense, Arachne?
So also does when you say overcoding, does that mean decoding and recoding?
Not necessarily. There's a reason they use overcoding specifically. Is they actually will take on code. Like they'll take on things that are local in order to and even allow people to have their own local sort of, you keep your silly little fucking dance. We don't really care, but now here's what it means. It's no longer, how to put it. I got to work a lot with Native American tribes, and you see a lot of the kids going out and about, and they're doing sun dances, rain dances, and all kinds of sort of, they're completely fucking disconnected from the reasons they were done before. They're in every single way. The code's the same, but it's not that anymore. Now it's another thing. There's an overcoding that happens. A decoding is this sort of breaking of meaning. So it's not that, it's still, but it's overcoded. It's a different thing. So by assimilating, it's an overcoding rather than a decoding, I think, as I understand it. No?
Yeah, because when they talk about capitalism, right? they're using decoding and recoding.
Yeah, well,
Um,
it's the challenge that they have is that the flux of becoming, the nature of desire can't be allowed to fucking escape, no matter what, no matter what. And so they have to necessarily code any flux that is not already coded, and they don't want to decode because that would have almost a trance of like freeing it. It's much more important to not allow those to escape. So the overcoding happens there. It's this really odd sort of push in that direction. I heard someone jumping in there though. Was that you, Jack?
No.
No, I thought I heard someone jumping in. Arachne, did my explanation help at all, or did it just make it worse? Which is entirely possible, and I'm aware. Okay, good. On overcoding, it's a worthwhile note, JK. The line, I was looking for a specific one in Holland's Guide on Anti-Oedipus. Always recommend it. It's great. The line he has here, though, just to sort of restate it, he's talking a lot more in a Marxist setup. So just to sort of go with it. Much the same can be said of labor relations in an overcoded symbolic order. To take another example, for even when surplus value derives from surplus labor, as it does in despotism, the surplus labor commanded by the law of the despot remains qualitatively distinct from the labor providing for the laborer's own subsistence, to the point it may even occur at a different time in a different place. And here's the line: overcoding retains and enforces a qualitative and fully meaningfully distinction between the two kinds of labor. Indeed, all the resources of discourse and symbolic culture, notably religion, really, are mobilized precisely to endow the distinction with meaning and make it believable in the strong sense of the term. This is the beast we're talking about sort of through all this. When we talk about overcoding, there's a reason. It's keeps these sort of the qualitative elements of these things distinct. It shifts uniquely rather than decoding, recoding, which again really allows sort of desire to break into something else. It allows a completely different sort of interaction. Overcoding, that's a beast. The other line he's gotten here.
Just
Go ahead.
to qualify the hall, I think he's talking about capital there.
He's talking about overcoding in general, but he is talking about, I mean, it's under the despot too.
Yeah, but because he's using the word labor.
He's always focused on capital, so it's kind of tough to say that. He's always focused on capitalism. So you're right in that he is always focused, but I do think it generally, again, it's more a good example of why not recoding and why overcoding instead.
Well, it's gonna shift when you get to capital, because now decoding's on the table. What you said earlier, that not necessarily, that's exactly right.
Okay,
The
maybe
despot
better.
doesn't want
Good.
to decode. But capital.
Yeah, then
So
ignore
remember,
what I just said.
codification-
I get a little nervous that my explanations are not as good as others, so I kind of grab, and I'm just going to leave it there because I think that's fair. It is fair. I mean, they have the line, just go back and reread a little bit of AO from now a month and a half ago. God, page 201. The despot's intervention forms part of the apparatus, a new economy in a repressing apparatus, a new mark, a new severity. It would be too easy if it were enough to make incest possible in this sovereign fashion for the exercise of psychic repression and in service of social repression to come to an end. But royal barbarian incest is merely the means of overcoding the flows of desire, not a means of liberating them.
Right, because the first two socii don't want to deal with decoding. Right, that's why they compensate through codification over codification. However, capital will use all three. And that's where Holland is coming from in
Mhm.
that passage. It's at that point when you're, because he's talking labor, it sounds like he's talking third socius. At that point,
That's true.
capital is using
Well, then let's
decodification
not confuse it.
and
Well,
the other.
let's not confuse it. Let's not confuse it. I agree. We're going to stop there, and we're going to move to the next We're going to move next paragraph, I think, because because I think we need to. I don't want to get in capital yet because it'll just confuse
Well, I
everything.
don't either. It's for the people who haven't read that chapter, those sections, they'll be like, "What the fuck are you guys
Yeah,
talking
shut the
about?"
fuck up. Shut the fuck up.
That'll be just too much to dive into decodification at this point.
God damn it. It's going to be a lot. It's a lot.
Well, it's easier when you're in that context because then they're going to explain what it is. But right now they're like, yeah, these guys don't want to touch that. Right?
This reading
So,
this time through is going to be
don't
so
wanna
much
deal with
different.
that.
This time through is going to be so much different because I've read Klosowski now, and it's clear they're
Oh, yeah?
taking from Living Currency, like a lot
Yeah.
from Living Currency. So it's going to be really fun to go through.
Yeah, it's a good
I
one.
recommend Klosowski, by the way. Let me see. Is there anything else? No. So let's take a step slightly back before I start the paragraph and talk about Oedipus, because we're going to be hitting Oedipus really hard again. Now, what are we talking about with Oedipus? We're talking about the psychoanalytic Oedipus. We're talking about the idea of Oedipus. We're talking about this pre-existing complex that is the base of humanity and the sexuality and desire and how desire works, and that the Oedipus complex is just based to humanity. And in fact, it's what makes us, and the repression of that desire is what makes us good. It's the proper repression of that is what makes us proper good citizens and can help us around. We need to be properly repressed because Oedipus is who we are. That's my very sarcastic opening to this, but it's the best way to describe what Oedipus is, because we're about to go fucking super deep into psychoanalytic shit, and you know that's my favorite thing. So let's do it. But we are still far from the psychoanalytic Oedipus, and the Hellenists are right to not grasp clearly the story that psychoanalysis is trying at all costs to tell them. It is indeed the story of desire and its sexual history. There is no other. But here all the parts figure as cogs and wheels in the state machine. Desire is by no means an interplay between a son, a mother, and a father. Desire institutes a libidinal investment of a state machine that overcodes the territorial machine and, with an additional turn of the screw, represses the desiring machines. Incest derives from this investment, and not the reverse. At first, it brings into play only the despot, the sister, and the mother. It is the overcoding and repressing representation. The father intervenes only as the representative of the old territorial machine, but the sister is the representative of the new alliance. The mother is the representative of direct filiation. Father and son are not yet born. All sexuality functions in terms of the conjoined operations of machines, their internecine struggle, their superposition, their interlocking arrangements. Let us marvel once again at Freud's account of Oedipus. In Moses and Monotheism, he indeed surmises that latency is a state affair. But then latency must not succeed the Oedipus complex, marking the complex's repression or even its suppression. It must result from the repressing action of the incestuous representation, which is not yet by any means a complex in the sense of repressed desire, since, on the contrary, the representation exercises its repressive action on desire itself. The Oedipus complex, as it is called by psychoanalysis, will be born of latency, after latency, and it signifies the return of the repressed under conditions that disfigure, displace, and even decode desire. The Oedipus complex appears only after latency, And when Freud recognizes two phases separated by latency, it is only the second phase that merits the complex's name, while the first expresses only its parts and wheels functioning from a completely different viewpoint, in a completely different organization. There we see the mania of psychoanalysis with all its paralogisms. It presents as a resolution, or an attempted resolution, of the complex what is rather the latter's definitive establishment or its interior installation, and it presents as the complex what is still the complex's opposite. What will be necessary in order for Oedipus to become the Oedipus complex? Many things, in fact, those things that Nietzsche partially grasped in the evolution of the infinite debt. Oh, there is so much to sort of talk through here that we could go so deep into it. There's so much in there.
So is he saying that the Oedipus embodies this infinite debt? Is it infinite debt to the despot?
Infinite debt to the despot? Yes.
Well, I think we need to. So the first thing we got to qualify here is like, notice they're talking. This is that strange game I mentioned earlier. There's Oedipus in all these different senses, and every sense is particular to the socius you're dealing with, right? And that's the difference between Oedipus and the Oedipus, like they say it there. So like the infinite debt plays a role in establishing Oedipus occupying two spots of the fourth paralogism, right? It plays a role in, as they're saying, like all five paralogisms seeming to be flushed out for the despotic. But, there's more to be said, for which you need capital to understand Oedipus in the full fanning of the fourth paralogism, right? The infinite debt is a big part of that, but like they're saying, right, Nietzsche's only partially grasping that evolution, and that evolution's going to continue into 2.9, right? And they're kind of cliffhanging us here, to be honest with you.
They're going to cliffhang us at the end here because obviously they don't want to get into that. But let's talk about what they're going over in this paragraph, though, because this isn't just sort of out of nowhere. Again, they're making very specific overtures against the general thought of how desire and humanity necessarily needs to work. If we go back, Moses and monotheism. Yes, look, Freud came out and was like, yeah, latency is this state affair. We have this repression that's built in, and ultimately Oedipus, comes about this, blah, blah, blah. He goes through all these things. His goal and his thing he's talking about, and again, this is the important shit, is you can see that this is necessary, this repression that we have to do, that has to take place, and that's the thing that they're doing. They're confusing what Oedipus is, the complex, from sort of its opposite. They say that kind of throughout. We have people who have developed in a power society, especially when we get to capitalism, we'll get further, who have all of these pieces, as they're talking about, that make up Oedipus, all these paralogisms, these fucked up ways of seeing the world that are really due to sort of the odd way production has been manipulated and taken over and how production's handled, but also the creation of the state, or the becoming of the state that sort of enforces and reinforces and places these things in place. And here we have the subjects coming out of it, which we're analyzing and we're looking at. But we do this fucked up thing where we see the problems people have, and we see the way that people are formed, and we assume this is how people are formed. Always. Not that these are how people are formed under determined social conditioning. A great example of this, this shit happens all the time. This isn't just psychoanalysis. This happens in neurological studies, social studies, all kinds of things across the board. there's this woman who she was working in Australia. This was like the 60s and 70s, and she was working with what we would call less skilled readers, to say the least. They were developmentally disabled in some way, way behind the curve. And what she noticed with these kids is that what they were doing is that they were really bad at associating the words with the things on the page. So she'd say, like, well, here we go. It's a see spot run, spot chases ball. And they would look and they would not be able to know the word for ball. And she went, because they'd try to guess, they go, spot chases a cookie, spot, like they guess, she couldn't. So she said, well, it's obvious what these kids need. They need to become better guessers. By the way, the story's not a fucking joke. So she invented an entire way of teaching kids how to read that's about guessing, not phonetics. She said phonetics is actually bad, that everyone learns this way by guessing what the word should be based on context. And so we should teach kids how to be better guessers. Not only did she find success in Australia, she became the primary way through the late 90s to 2000s to today in America, Canada, parts of Europe, that this is how we teach. Every fucking study that's ever been done has shown that this is just an insane load of shit. This is still how we teach kids, because she saw, and teachers saw it, it intuitively hits people when they spend time with these kids. They go, oh yeah, they're just bad guessers. We just need to teach them to be better guessers. And this is what psychoanalysts did. They saw, oh, look, these people have these fucked up things. We need to teach them how to live with these fucked up things and be well adjusted. We need to work with this system. We need to keep this the way it is, instead of wondering, well, wait, why are they trying to guess? Should we maybe break that down and go before that? Should we go beyond these things? And that's what their argument is here. It's not that we, as they say, they say at the end here, it's one of the good lines, the Oedipus complex appears only after latency, afterward, when Freud recognizes the two phases separated. There we see the mania of psychoanalysis with all its paralogisms. It presents as a resolution, an attempted resolution of the complex, what is rather the latter's definitive establishment or its interior installation. And it presents as the complex what is still the opposite. There's a lot of stuff that needs to come into place here, but this is what psychoanalysis does, is it takes these pieces and goes, oh, we've got to figure out how to install them right, instead of realizing that they're kind of fucked up. That's my way of explaining this. I mean, it's my way of explaining kind of the book and their critique of Oedipus at all. But this is, by the way, Sold a Story, great podcast. There's a lot of literature on how kids learning to read. It's the most depressing thing. A lot of you probably fucking listening to this probably learned this way, and horrifies me. But this is kind of the setup. So with that, questions, please.
Why don't we chunk this out a little bit more?
All right.
So, I mean, again, like there's Oedipus in different senses, right? And that's, in a lot of ways, that's kind of the crux of this paragraph, or at least a basis for that crux. Okay. So the question of the paragraph is basically like, what's the relationship between like Oedipus with, let's focus on the despotic, but also the primitive, and what will be that relationship to Oedipus under capital, right? Even though they're just kind of teeing up that point. I don't even think they say the word capital, but that's kind of the implication there. It's indeed the story of desire.
Well, the opening here, to chunk it, they have the line, desire is by no means an interplay between a son, mother, and father. This is them outright stating their thesis of the book. Desire institutes a libidinal investment of a state machine that overcodes a territorial machine and, with an additional turn, represses desiring machines. This is the core thesis of everything they've been bringing up. they're, again, as I think I said earlier, they don't want to say that this is the base way that humanity works. It's not that desire is an interplay between son, mother, and father, as Freud will say, or as Lacan will say, as psychoanalysis says, as fucking pop culture and I think everything says these days, nuclear families, everything to all these conservatives. Instead, desire actually first invests socially, and it does so in the state that overcodes this, that like this process, and ultimately represses desiring machines with the final move. This is the actual process, and this is the thing that they're sort of stating, I think, clearly here. Go ahead, Jack. Sorry.
That's cool. So I mean, so like this point about desire and sexual history, right? So this is a question of desiring production, social production. The question of desiring production, social production. So here all the parts figure as cogs and wheels in the state machine, right? So they're posing the question in terms of despotic, really. Desire is by no means an interplay between the son, mother, and a father. Okay. Desire institutes a libidinal investment of this. So yeah, this is very square in the despotic. Desire institutes a libidinal investment of a state machine that overcodes the territorial machine, and with an additional turn of the screw, represses the desiring machines. Okay, so there's your tension between social production and desiring production. That's what gets displaced in the fourth paralogism. Awesome. Incest derives from this investment and not the reverse. Okay, so incest derives from that tension. First, it brings into play on the despot, the sister, and the mother. So incest begins with the despot, sister, and the mother. Notice it's not the father there, and it's not the
It's not that
son, it's the sister.
incest doesn't, it derives from is I think it's an important distinction rather than begins. Sorry, it's the way that they talk about it. Incest arises from this investment, not the other way around. Initially, only involves the despot, the sister, and the mother. It is he, the overcoding, and repressing representation. Oh man, they changed that. They changed that a bit.
Still, it's still putting the paralogisms with the fourth paralogism, right? It's the overcoding
Yes.
and repressing representation. So the repressing representation in the earth was the alliant, and I can't quite remember what it is in the despotic, but that's what they're focusing on there. That
Yes.
which does the repressing.
Yeah, it's not the
So
father. It's not the father because the father ultimately is only a representative of the old territorial machine because the despot is everyone's father, everyone's brother. And so the father as repressive law doesn't enter into it the same way it will in the Oedipus we know. That's the next line. The
yeah,
father only intervenes as the old territorial machine. The sister is the representative of the new alliance. The mother, the representative of direct filiation.
right. And so the father, oh boy. So the father is the germinal influx of the earth, right? The sister,
The father is?
yes, because the representative in the primitive is the germinal influx. So it's if I follow them correctly, it's the germinal influx of the earth.
See, I let me. What is the original French for that one? Just a second. No, see it is very specific. The father is the representative of the old territorial machine. Um, like he is the representative. The father only intervenes as the representative of the old territorial machine. To me, that's less the germinal influx. The father wouldn't be one there. Instead, he would be. I mean, quite literally, just the old territorial machine is a representative of that old system. I don't know if we would see the germinal influx as the father here.
That's a fair question. I could be wrong there. Sister is the representative of the new alliance. Okay. Mother is the representative of direct filiation. So the mother's, that sounds like the mother's still coming from the earth there. Because I believe the extended filiation is the despotic, right? So this is still, yeah, this is in tension between the earth and the despotic still. Because father and son are not yet born, right? Because the sister, that's the thing about Oedipus, right? It's always a son, it's usually not the daughter.
Yes.
For that, you would need the Electra complex. It's ironic because a lot of Freud's early patients were women. But, anyways, all sexuality functions in terms of the conjoined operations of machines, their internecine struggle, their superposition, their interlocking. Okay, so it's just the three syntheses. Okay, so Freud uses a text to say that latency is a state of affair. Great, so that's exactly what we were just discussing last paragraph. But then latency must not succeed the Oedipus complex. So latency can't overtake the Oedipus complex. It's a very interesting way of saying that. Marking the complex's repression or even its suppression. So latency cannot overtake the Oedipus complex, and yet latency represses the complex. That's very interesting. It must result from the repressing action of the incestuous representation. So the complex comes from the act of repression on the incestuous representation, which is not yet by any means a complex in the sense of repressed desire, since on the contrary, the representation exercises its repressive action on desire itself. That makes sense because in both you're still dealing with the germinal influx. The
Yes.
Oedipus complex. Oh, go ahead. Did you have
No,
something
no, I
there?
was just going to say yes. After a little bit of back and forth in the text, I'm going to say for sure the father's not the germinal. Instead, he's playing the sort of, um, because of the phrasing they've got there, the old territorial machine. What the father will fall into then in capital is the role of the authority, because he will then take on the role of the old despotic machine. Like it's that same position. Just saying.
Okay. Oedipus complex, as it is called by psych, will be born of latency, after latency, and it signifies the return of the repressed. Okay, so we're talking about subjectivity under conditions that disfigure, displace, and even decode desire. Okay, so it's it's the fourth paralogism, but now we're introducing decoding. This is actually mirroring our conversation earlier. The Oedipus complex appears only after latency, so after the despotic. And when Freud recognizes two phases separated by latency, it is only the second phase that merits the complex's name, while the first expresses only its parts and wheels functioning from a completely different viewpoint and a completely different organization. Okay, so this is Oedipus under despotic, Oedipus under capital.
And Oedipus under capital is the complex.
Right. There we see the mania of psychoanalysis with all its paralogisms. Alt 5, it presents as a resolution or an attempted resolution of the it presents as a resolution or an attempted resolution of the complex, what is rather the latter's definitive establishment, so it attempts to resolve latency or its interior installation.
It
And
attempts to resolve the latency of Oedipus, but by doing so creates the complex.
and it presents as the complex what is still the complex's opposite. That sounds to me like at the despotic Oedipus.
Yes, that's what I mean. It presents as a
Okay.
resolution or attempted resolution of the complex, what is the latter's definitive, and the latter being the wait, what is the latter in that one?
I think it's a latency, right? I think this is like
That's
so
translation.
it presents latency as a resolution to Oedipus to the Oedipus complex. So under capital, right? It's as though latency solves the Oedipus complex, However, it is rather the latter's definitive, and it presents, however, the complex of Oedipus appears to just be, I think this is just the despotic
Uh,
Oedipus.
I'm gonna, God damn, the translation shit sometimes. Allow me to restate. Um, this is the mania of psychoanalysis with all its paralogisms. To present as resolution or attempt at resolution of the complex that which is its definitive establishment or interior installation, and to present as complex that which is still the opposite. That's almost word for word exactly what the original is.
Yeah, I see it now. So it's we're still in the despotic here because the next sentence is going to say. So this is interesting. Right? This is like the conditions of psychoanalysis from the standpoint of the despotic,
Mm-hmm.
while understanding that there are conditions for psychoanalysis under capital, and it closes on the latter,
Yes.
right? The conditions for psychoanalysis, the five paralogisms in the despotic, I think what they're saying is it appears to resolve the, the fourth paralogism by means um, of Oedipus in a sense that has not yet overtaken the full fourth paralogism. In doing so, it keeps the complex of Oedipus in that sense, right? It
God
keeps
damn, this
the despotic
translation.
Oedipus. What will be necessary in order for Oedipus to become the Oedipus, so under capital, and that's the cliffhanger. But yeah, okay, they're just restating the despotic problem there.
Translation
They're just doing
sucks.
it through latency. I think it's just a confusing sentence structure.
It really isn't. It is in the translation only.
Um, Fair enough. I mean, I don't read French, but yeah,
I
it's
mean,
just
the word, there's no the
awkward to me.
latter, and I don't even know what it's referring to in that phrasing. It's just very weird. I think the way the French states it, the original is just very crisp. This is the mania of psychoanalysis with all its paralogisms, to present as resolution or attempt at resolution of the complex, that which is its definitive establishment or interior installation, to present as complex that which is still the opposite. Again, the complex, and this is, I think, the play they're making here. Tell me what your thoughts are, but the complex that we have, the Oedipal complex, mommy, daddy, me, the preset representational relationship triangulated that I want to fuck my mom, kill my dad, and that I am placed inside of that in a healthy way. This complex, the thing that they're doing is basically returning me to these pieces that are the opposite of a complex. They're the actual built movement of desire under power structures. Uh, and so what they're doing, this really fucked up thing, we have the complex, and their goal to fix that is to further install and sort of harden not anything related to the complex, but instead pieces of it that are more emergent and existent historically.
So I read it as like, so they're trying to go through the conditions of Oedipus and why capital produces the conditions for the Oedipus complex, since we're going to pull out the versus Oedipus in a more general sense for the despotic, right? And that's where you get that clubfoot despot speak in the preceding paragraph. And basically what they're saying is like the latency makes it possible for Oedipus to do this move into the limit, and yet at the same time it keeps Oedipus from becoming a complex, right? Which is to simply say that it doesn't take the spot of the germinal influx for the despotic any more than the primitive. But then they cliffhang you and they're like, yeah, and something happens where it does. And that's capital, and that's where they kind of end, right? So they leave the air in the room,
Yeah.
as it were.
Um, I'm gonna take a second to look a thing up because I think there's the translation is fucking I fucking hate it so much. I hate this so much, dude. Um, Freud, correct me if I'm wrong before I start diving down, and someone who's smarter than me, feel free to just dive in, especially if you know Freud. Freud didn't really spend a ton of time talking about Oedipus, but the first time he talked about Oedipus was in Moses' monotheism. This idea of these pieces of Oedipus that were a state affair, and as he's talking about it here, as they're saying, but then it became a complex in the second time. So the way it's written here in the English is kind of weird because Freud's account of Oedipus and monotheism, he additions says that latency is a state affair, but then latency must not succeed the Oedipus complex, repression or suppression, blah, blah, blah. The French, very slightly different. But they say it slightly differently because it's a move the second time is how they phrase it. So it's Freud goes over these things twice. The first time he identifies the parts, and then the second time he names the complex. And this is the fucked up thing that he did here. This is the point, because the latency can't succeed the complex. That it's a note you got stuck on too. I did too when I was reading it, because it's like there's a latency that marking its, but wait, and it just becomes this thing that's just picking at me. It's because it's sort of written different in the French.
Well, I can't speak to the translation, but I mean, they're agreeing with Freud actually. Like,
yes, they are.
the thing that this is getting at is, right, like under despotism, Oedipus is a state affair, meaning it's, it is of the transcendent uses, right? It is of 2 spots out of 3 of the 4th paralogism. What's going to be and they're basically saying Freud agrees, right? Because the complex can't supersede that. And so, prior to capital, basically, is what they're saying. Prior to capital, and this is where it simplifies. Oedipus doesn't take that 3rd spot in which Oedipus stands in for desire, right? And that's going to be that's the real leap that's going to happen with capital in the 4th paralogism.
Yeah, the translation. So I'm going to read a little bit, and you tell me if this changes a little bit here. So they go through it's much the same as what you're saying. It's they talk about Moses' monotheism, Freud, and they're agreeing with him. It marks the repression of the complex or its own suppression. It must result from the repressing action of incestuous representation, blah, 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 blah. To skip down, the Oedipus complex only appears after latency. There we go. You see where I'm at in that one? I don't understand the translation here. When Freud recognizes twice separated by this, it is only the second time that deserves the name of the complex, the first only expressing the parts and cogs. Fucking totally different meaning as I read it. Because it basically, they're talking about Freud recognizing the blah, blah, seeing the pieces, calling it Oedipus, and then he sees this thing, and then he names it. Now he's calling it the latency. The second phase merits the name. They're really going hard, actually agreeing with Freud, but sort of undoing the dogmatic image that has sort of been done in his name of what the complex is. Am I wrong?
It's an evolution of Oedipus, right? So
Yeah.
it's, that's kind of, and that's the interesting thing they're saying about Freud, right? They're saying even Freud recognizes an evolution, which is, it's always humorous when they do this. I would suggest we try to squeeze in this last paragraph, though.
Yeah, I want to finish it so we can go to Erstat next week, or maybe even just do a pause and do a reading group next week, just a discussion. Let's give it a shot.
Either way.
The Oedipal cell will have to complete its migration. It must no longer be content to pass from the state of the displaced represented to that of repressing representation. Rather, from being the repressing representation, it will have to finally become the representative of desire itself. And it must become the latter by virtue of being the displaced represented. The debt must not only become an infinite debt, it will have to be internalized and spiritualized as an infinite debt. Christianity and what follows. The Father and the Son will have to take form. That is, the royal triad must masculinize itself. This must occur as a direct consequence of the infinite debt that is now internalized. Oedipus the despot will have to be replaced by Oedipuses as subjects, Oedipuses as subjugated individuals, Oedipuses as fathers, and Oedipuses as sons. All the formal operations will have to be resumed within a decoded social field and must reverberate in the pure and private element of interiority, of interior reproduction. The apparatus of social repression, psychic repression, will have to undergo a complete reorganization. Hence, desire, having completed its migration, will have to experience this extreme affliction of being turned against itself. The turning back against itself, bad conscience, the guilt that attaches it to the most decoded of social fields, as well as to the sickest interiority, the trap for desire, its ugly growth. So long as the history of desire does not experience this outcome, Oedipus haunts all societies, but as the nightmare of something that has still not happened to them. Its hour has not come. And this isn't this the strength of Lacan to have saved psychoanalysis from the frenzied Oedipalization to which it was linking its fate, to have brought about this salvation to which it was linking its fate, to have brought about this salvation even at the price of a regression, and even though it meant that the unconscious would be kept under the weight of despotic apparatus, that it would be reinterpreted, starting from this apparatus, the law and the signifier. Phallus and castration, yes, Oedipus know the despotic age of the unconscious. Exciting fun.
Yeah, I mean, this is literally what we were just saying, right? This is just. It's funny they made the Christianity point because Christianity happens under the despotic, but fair enough. Yeah, so this is just they're just teeing up what happens when Oedipus stands in
They're
for
pulling in
desire.
Nietzsche. They're pulling in Nietzsche.
It's like
They're
sure.
pulling in Nietzsche. That's what they're doing there. They're trying to tie it back to bad conscience and everything. That they keep bringing up Nietzsche at the end of these paragraphs.
Sure, but Christianity, like the Holy Roman Empire, happened before capitalism. Is my point.
Yeah.
So to me, it's ironic, right? But that being said, right? So there's two things hitting here, right? One is that they're squaring into like subjectivity now, and two, they're looking at how Oedipus, when it takes that third place in the fourth paralogism, right? Now it's standing in for desire, and what's interesting is they do a nice little linking of that with subjectivity. Um, Everything else is just kind of like puffed up, or I don't want to say that, but is kind of around that point.
Yeah, it's a couple things here. Big pushes. The first is the masculinization of the setup. We were talking about the fathers and sons and how they aren't really, a big deal to the despot. Not that way. It's a different shift in how all these things are sort of built and how these things are made. To me, the infinite debt, the Christianity they're talking about, there is Christianity as a whole, sure, yeah, but they're talking about the same Christianity Nietzsche's critiquing, which is the active one in the 1800s, 1900s, and 2000s. Like, they're talking about Christianity and what follows. And, well, it is despotic, but certainly it is. The infinite debt is a big part of that. The father and son must take form. There's a reason they bring up Christianity, father, son, Trinity, triad, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's a lot of symbolism that they're playing with inside of this. But the masculinization needs to be a direct consequence of the infinite debt that is now internalized. The subject has now internalized it. It's no longer an external threat. It's no longer extended direct filiation and extended filiation and direct alliance. God damn it. I always go backwards with this. Just to read the footnote they have from Nietzsche, historians of religion and psychoanalysts are very familiar with this problem of masculization of the imperial triad in terms of the father-son relationship that's brought into it. Nietzsche sees in this problem an essential moment in the development of infinite debt. Quote, that stroke of genius on the part of Christianity, God himself sacrifices himself from the guilt of mankind. God himself makes payment to himself. The creditor sacrifices himself for his debtor out of love. Can one even credit that? Out of love for the debtor. It's a really good line. It is. And then what's happened is like, oh, you can't ever pay this back. The infinite debt now moves internal. So now it's Oedipus's father, Oedipus subjugated, Oedipus's subject. The move changes because it has to be internalized. This is this sort of last few steps they're talking about here. The other half is, and I think it's an important one, the potential space, the virtual space in all societies. Oedipus is there. This is just like the despot is waiting or the state is waiting. These things are sort of there in the potential of just how desire interacts. And these, if it hasn't happened yet, it's on its way or it's haunting it, as they phrase. Because it's in the potential, the virtual space of all of them. I also like the nice note to Lacan in there. And they don't hate Lacan. Nice note. I think it's a nice note. And kind of their point is for Oedipus as a thing, Lacan did kind of get rid of Oedipus. Like, Oedipus doesn't work the same way for Lacan as it did for Freud. For Freud, it's very base layer, this thing that, this is how the id forms desire, produces, and castration, blah, blah, blah. Lacan used the triangulation and sort of blew it apart. He did keep the pieces, which is their thing that they're sort of also critiquing, but he does sort of shift it. So instead, it's a discussion about the symbolization, the signification, the master signifier, and how it interweaves all of these different things, rather than having it be about Oedipus complex. Oedipus complex is now this symbolic thing that interplays into anxiety and paranoia and a lot of other things. So there's a big push, again, that still has lack, as they say here. Phallus and castration, yes. Oedipus, no. That's kind of a jokey way to talk about Lacan, but it's not incorrect, I don't think. So that's 3.7. How exciting is that? Huh? Everyone? You're excited? I know you fucking are. I'll set up a poll probably, figure out if next week we want to do like a roundtable question thing. Because it's like, you think this fucking section was difficult? You ain't seen shit yet. Urstad's short. Urstad is genuinely, I think, really underrated. But it's tiny, and man, we're not going to be able to really get a lot out of it that we won't have to spend weeks on. It's too short, and there hasn't really been a lot of secondary literature on it, sadly. But once we get to 3.9 and the rest, this is all come into capital. And if you do not grasp what we just went through on 3.7, you are fucked. So please take time. We will probably do a thing, write out some questions and post them in the Anti-Oedipus forum in our Discord, discord.gg/DGQC. You can head there anytime and toss questions in there. I will pick out, and we'll probably pick them out of a hat and just start spending time discussing a few of those next week. I'll see if I can get a couple other people to join. That'll be fun. We'll see if we can really beat up some questions and try to explain things tightly, because now we're moving into the real shit. And this is where, honestly, a lot of people get things really fucking wrong, to be honest. So, yeah. With that, thank all of you. I look forward to seeing you next week. We will make our way through all this then.